James was starving, digging through the trash near the upscale restaurants at the foot of the volcano. No one noticed him. No one cared. But as he chewed on a stale piece of sandwich, he felt a faint tremor beneath his feet. He looked around. Tourists laughed. Waiters served expensive meals. No one, seemed to notice. Seconds later, a deafening roar shattered the air and the sky turned grey. The mountain was alive. Tourists screamed, running in panic. And that's when James saw her. Mia Lennox, trapped on a crumbling ledge, the ground beneath her feet breaking apart. Lava was beginning to flow, straight toward her. He knew that if he didn't act now, she would be swallowed by the fire. But what seemed like a natural disaster would soon reveal something much darker. The eruption was no accident, and Mia wasn't there by coincidence. Stay until the end to uncover the truth hidden beneath the ashes. You won't believe what really happened. Hunger was a knife with an invisible blade, cutting James from the inside out with silent, merciless strokes. He could no longer remember the last decent meal he had eaten, something that wasn't scraps scavenged from trash bins or half-eaten leftovers discarded by careless tourists. His stomach twisted painfully as he crouched beside a row of overflowing dumpsters behind one of the high-end restaurants near the base of the volcano. The scent of sizzling steaks and buttered seafood drifted through the air, mingling cruelly with the acrid stench of rotting food. His fingers, calloused and trembling, dug through the filth, pushing aside moldy bread, wilted lettuce and soggy paper napkins. He barely noticed the filth caking under his fingernails anymore. Dignity was a luxury he had abandoned long ago. What mattered now was survival. The tourists dined under strings of warm, golden lights, sipping expensive wine, their laughter spilling into the night like an endless melody of indulgence. They were oblivious to him, to the invisible life he led in the shadows of their extravagance. James had learned to make himself small, to blend into the alleys and the back streets where no one cared to look. The city wasn't cruel to him out of malice. It was indifferent, and that was worse. He tore open a greasy paper bag and exhaled in relief when he found half a sandwich inside. The bread was dry, the lettuce wilted, but the sight of food made his mouth flood with anticipation. His fingers closed around it, careful not to crush what little sustenance he had found. Nearby, a discarded juice box lay on its side, its expiration date long past. He hesitated only a moment before grabbing it, knowing that beggars couldn't afford to be choosers. Then it happened. A tremor, faint but unmistakable, pulsed beneath his feet. James froze, his body going rigid as he instinctively placed a hand on the ground, feeling the subtle shift in the earth beneath him. It was barely noticeable, just a whisper of movement, but enough to stir a deep, primal instinct within him. He glanced up, searching the faces of the tourists, the servers, anyone who might have noticed what he had felt. But nothing. They went on with their lives, oblivious to the warning beneath them. The laughter continued, the clinking of glasses, the scrape of cutlery against porcelain. A man in a crisp white suit gestured animatedly, spilling a few drops of red wine onto the pristine tablecloth, unconcerned. It was as if the earth itself had spoken a secret only James had heard. He swallowed hard, his grip tightening around the sandwich. Was it his imagination? Hunger did strange things to the body, made the mind fragile, susceptible to hallucinations. He shook his head, forcing himself to focus on the food in his hands. This was what mattered. The tremor was nothing. The volcano had been dormant for years. He needed to eat, to get through the night, but his hands were trembling now, not from hunger, but from something else, something deeper. He took a bite of the stale bread, forcing himself to chew, to ignore the unease curling in his gut. And then the world shattered. A deafening roar ripped through the air, loud enough to drown out the city itself. The ground beneath him lurched violently, sending trash cans toppling over, spilling their contents into the alleyway. The elegant dining tables trembled as glasses toppled and shattered, the pristine white tablecloths now stained with spilled wine and fallen meals. The tourists' laughter turned into screams as the golden lights flickered, then burst in showers of sparks. The air was thick with confusion, panic, and something far more terrifying, an ancient, guttural sound from deep within the earth. James stumbled backward, his heart pounding against his ribs as he turned toward the mountain. The volcano that had stood silent for years, looming over the city like an indifferent god, was no longer still. A thick column of black smoke coiled into the sky, twisting and writhing like a living thing. From the summit, a dull, fiery glow pulsed, flickering like a heartbeat. The tremors intensified, turning the cobblestone streets into a treacherous landscape of shifting ground. Buildings groaned under the strain, their foundations cracking. The scent of sulfur, sharp and suffocating, invaded his lungs. People ran, pushing past each other in blind panic. Mothers clutched their children, men abandoned their expensive meals, and waiters fled without looking back. James barely had time to register the chaos before another shockwave hit, this one powerful enough to send him sprawling to the ground. His half-eaten sandwich tumbled from his grasp, landing in the dirt beside him. Forgotten, a burst of heat licked at his face, and he shielded his eyes, coughing as ash began to rain from the sky, coating the world in a fine grey dust. He knew, in that instant, that nothing would ever be the same again. James barely had time to register the screams before the first wave of panic hit like a tsunami. Tourists sprinted in every direction, their expensive shoes skidding on the cobblestone streets as they shoved past each other in blind terror. A woman in a silk dress tripped over an overturned chair, her wine glass shattering beside her as she crawled backward, eyes wide with disbelief at the sky now choked with thick black smoke. A father grabbed his son's wrist, pulling him forcefully away from the square while the child sobbed, reaching for a dropped stuffed toy left behind in the chaos. The city, moments ago filled with laughter and clinking glasses, had turned into an open-air theater of hysteria. James barely moved, his pulse hammering against his skull as he struggled to process what he was seeing. The mountain, the same one that had loomed silently over them for years, was alive. Flames flickered at its peak, casting eerie shadows against the swirling smoke, and for the first time in his life, James felt something that even hunger had never been able to summon. Fear. Real, unrelenting fear. A deep, primal instinct told him to run, get as far away as possible before the mountain decided to swallow the city whole. But as he turned, something in the distance caught his eye, a flash of movement where there should have been none. High up on the mountainside, just beyond a crumbling ledge, stood a lone figure, a girl. James squinted through the haze of smoke and falling ash, his breath hitching in his throat as realization slammed into him like a freight train. She wasn't running, she wasn't even moving, she was trapped. The ground beneath her had begun to split apart in jagged lines, deep cracks spreading like veins through the dry earth. Below her, a thick, glowing river of molten lava had begun its slow, merciless descent, its bright orange glow casting an unnatural light on her terrified face. James felt something cold and sharp coil around his spine. She was going to die. If no one did something, if he didn't do something, she would be swallowed whole by the fire, reduced to nothing but a name lost in the destruction. His body moved before his mind could stop him. His feet hit the uneven stone path, dodging fallen debris as he fought against the stampede of panicked civilians. Someone grabbed his arm, a sweaty, trembling hand, yanking him back. "What are you doing?" a man shouted, his voice raw with terror. "We have to get out of here!" James barely registered him. He wrenched free, shoving past a group of tourists huddled under a collapsed awning. The girl was still up there. He could see her now, blonde hair streaked with soot, her arms wrapped around her chest as if bracing for the inevitable. She wasn't screaming, wasn't calling for help. She just stood there, frozen in place, watching death creep toward her with slow, burning inevitability. James's stomach twisted violently. She had given up. His legs burned as he climbed, the ground beneath him vibrating with each distant explosion from the mountain's core. The air was thick with heat, choking his lungs with every breath, but he pushed forward, driven by something far stronger than instinct. He didn't know this girl. He didn't even know if he could save her, but none of that mattered now. The only thing that mattered was reaching her before the fire did. The ledge she stood on was crumbling, chunks of rock breaking away and plummeting into the chasm below. Lava had begun to flow faster, consuming everything in its path. James could hear the distant cries of people farther down the mountain, but their voices blurred into white noise. There was only him, only her, and the fire that threatened to consume them both. He reached the base of the cliff just as the first section of the ledge gave way. The girl stumbled, her arms flailing as she struggled to regain her balance. "Hey!" James shouted, his voice hoarse from the smoke. "Don't move!" It was a stupid thing to say. She obviously had no control over the ground beneath her, but it was all his panic-fueled brain could come up with. She turned her head toward him, her eyes locking onto his. Even from this distance, he could see the sheer terror in them, the way her breath hitched unevenly in her chest. I can't," she choked out, coughing against the ash-filled air. "The ground, it's breaking." James clenched his fists. She was right. Another deep crack splintered beneath her feet, and for a heart-stopping moment, she teetered forward as if gravity itself had made the decision for her. James moved. His hands found the rough surface of the rock wall, his fingers gripping tightly as he began to climb. The heat was unbearable, radiating off the lava below like the breath of a dragon, but he ignored it, focusing only on the girl above. Sweat dripped from his forehead, mixing with soot and dust as he hoisted himself higher. A rock came loose under his foot, and for a terrifying second, he thought he was going to fall. His fingers tightened, nails scraping against the stone as he steadied himself. "Just hold on," he yelled again, though he wasn't sure if it was meant for her or himself. The ledge cracked again, louder this time, splitting just inches from where she stood. James reached up, stretching his arm as far as it would go. "You need to jump," he urged, his voice almost lost in the roaring chaos around them. The girl shook her head violently. "I can't," she cried. "I'll fall." "You're gonna fall anyway," James shot back, desperation seeping into his words. "Jump now, or the ground's gonna make the choice for you." Another explosion from the volcano sent tremors through the mountain, and this time there was no warning. The ledge gave way beneath her completely. A scream tore through the air as the girl fell. James lunged, his fingers brushing against empty space for a fraction of a second before they closed around her wrist. The force of her weight nearly yanked him from the rock face, but he locked his arm, his muscles straining as he held on. "Got you!" he gasped, his entire body trembling with the effort. The girl dangled helplessly, her other hand scrambling to find something to grip. I can't hold on," she sobbed. "Yes, you can." James gritted his teeth, his grip tightening. "Look at me, just look at me." Her wild eyes met his, her lips trembling as she fought against panic. "I won't drop you," he said, his voice steady despite the burn in his arms. "I swear to you, I won't." Slowly, painfully, he began pulling her up. His muscles screamed in protest. His breath came in short, ragged bursts, but inch by inch, he lifted her toward him. The lava below hissed and bubbled, sending up bursts of scorching heat, but he ignored it. When she was close enough, he hooked an arm under her, using the last reserves of his strength to haul her onto the narrow ledge beside him. They collapsed together, both gasping for breath, their bodies covered in sweat and ash. The mountain rumbled again, a cruel reminder that their fight was far from over. James turned to her, their faces inches apart. "We need to move," he said, his voice raw but determined. "Now!" And for the first time she nodded. James's feet pounded against the uneven trail, each step a gamble against the ground that threatened to give way beneath him. Every muscle in his body screamed for relief, but there was no time for rest, no room for fear. The narrow path up the mountainside was littered with debris, chunks of rock that had torn free from the mountain's core and now tumbled down like warnings from a furious earth. As he sprinted forward, his lungs burned with the acrid scent of ash and sulfur, the air thick with the heat from the approaching lava. There was no escaping the roar of the volcano. It filled the sky, drowning out everything else. James knew that every second counted. Every misstep could mean the difference between life and death, for him and for the girl whose life hung by a thread. The sight of Mia, stranded on a fragile outcrop of rock, drove him forward with reckless abandon. He could see the terror in her wide, frantic eyes, her hands clutching desperately at the crumbling ground beneath her feet. The ledge she stood on was shrinking with every passing moment, deep fissures spreading like spiderwebs beneath her sneakers. She was trapped, with nowhere to go but down, into the molten river slowly creeping closer. "Mia!" James shouted, but the roar of the eruption swallowed his voice. She didn't seem to hear him, or maybe she was too paralyzed by fear to respond. Either way, he had to reach her. There was no one else. There was no time to think, only to act. James's legs pushed him harder, faster. He dodged a cascade of smaller rocks that clattered down the slope, each impact echoing ominously in the smoke-filled air. The ground shifted underfoot, cracks appearing and widening beneath the soles of his worn-out shoes. He felt the terrifying give of loose earth, the gut-wrenching sensation of a surface that could crumble away at any moment. But he couldn't stop, couldn't look back. Every muscle was on edge, every nerve screamed in protest, but he ignored it all. There was only the sight of Mia, frozen on that ledge, her eyes locked on the lava that surged. Closer, consuming everything in its path. He stumbled, almost losing his footing as the trail suddenly narrowed, barely a foot wide now and slick with dust. A rock, dislodged by the tremors, crashed down behind him, sending up a spray of ash that blinded him for a moment. He wiped his eyes, blinking rapidly as he clawed his way forward. "Mia, I'm coming!" he yelled, the words ripped from his throat by the thick, choking air. She looked up then, a single tear-streaked face peering through the haze. Her lips parted, but no sound emerged, only the silent scream of someone who knew they were moments from disaster. The final stretch was the hardest. The trail led to a steep incline, the earth beneath it scarred and unstable. James scrambled up, using his hands to pull himself over rocks, his breath coming in harsh, ragged gasps. The ground shook violently, and for a terrifying second he thought it was all over, that the entire side of the mountain was about to collapse. He threw himself flat against the ground, feeling the tremor pass beneath him like a living thing. When it finally settled, he lifted his head, and there she was, Mia, just a few feet away, her back pressed against the cliff, face staring at the widening chasm below. He reached out, every muscle straining as he extended his arm toward her. "Take my hand," he shouted, desperation clear in his voice. Mia glanced down at the lava flow, then back at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "I can't," she cried, shaking her head, shaking her. "The ground, it's going to give way." James felt a surge of frustration. "Don't think, just move," he commanded, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Trust me, Mia, now." Her hesitation lasted only a heartbeat longer before she lunged, her fingers just barely brushing his as the ledge beneath her finally crumbled. In that split second, as the ground vanished under Mia's feet, James's hand closed around her wrist. The impact jerked him forward, nearly pulling him over the edge as well, but he held on, his grip ironclad. Mia dangled above the inferno, her feet kicking at empty space, a terrified sob escaping her lips. "Don't let go! Please, don't let go!" she screamed, panic transforming her voice into a high-pitched wail. "I've got you," James grunted, his arms straining under the weight. "I'm not letting go. Just don't move." Every second felt like an eternity as he struggled to pull her up, his muscles burning, fingers slipping as dust and sweat slickened his grip. With one final, desperate heave, James managed to drag her onto the narrow ledge beside him. They collapsed against the rock face, gasping for air, their bodies trembling with adrenaline and fear. For a moment, they simply lay there, side by side, too exhausted to speak, too shaken to move. The volcano's roar seemed distant now, muffled by the pounding of their hearts. The ground was still unstable, the threat of collapse all too real. But for this brief, fragile moment, they had survived. James turned to Mia, their faces inches apart, and gave her a weary smile. "Told you I wouldn't let go," he said, voice raw and breathless. She nodded, tears streaking down her soot-covered cheeks. But there was something in her eyes, something that looked a lot like hope. But the danger wasn't over. James could feel the heat intensifying, the ground beneath them trembling as if warning them to keep moving. "We need to get off this mountain," he said, forcing himself to his feet. Mia stared at the destruction below, her expression one of dazed horror. "How are we going to make it?" she asked, voice small and unsteady. James clenched his fists, forcing the fear out of his mind. "We're not dead yet," he said, more to himself than to her. "We'll find a way." As if to emphasize the urgency, a massive boulder broke free from the cliff above them, crashing down where Mia had been standing only moments before. It exploded on impact, sending shards of rock flying in all directions. The sound jolted Mia to her feet, her eyes wide with renewed terror. Okay, I'm moving," she shouted, as though convincing herself as much as him. They picked their way along the edge, carefully navigating the crumbling path. Every step was a test of faith, a leap into the unknown, where the wrong move could send them tumbling into the fiery abyss below. The volcano rumbled ominously, the sound like a monstrous growl that reverberated through their bones. James kept a firm grip on Mia's arm, guiding her along the narrow trail. "Just keep your eyes ahead," he advised, his voice barely audible over the chaos. "Don't look down. Whatever you do, don't look down." She nodded, biting her lip to stifle another sob, her gaze fixed determinedly on the path in front of her. Every instinct screamed at them to run, but James knew that speed wouldn't save them now. Careful, deliberate steps were the only chance they had. The trail twisted and turned, each corner revealing new dangers. Rock slides, geysers of steam, and the omnipresent threat of molten lava edging ever closer. At one point, the path was blocked by a massive boulder, too high to climb, too wide to go around. James cursed under his breath, searching frantically for an alternative route. "This way!" he shouted, spotting a narrow gap between the rocks. He squeezed through first, then helped Mia navigate the tight space. The air grew hotter, the smoke thicker, and every breath became a struggle. But inch by inch, step by cautious step, they moved forward. At last the trail widened slightly, revealing a narrow plateau that overlooked the churning chaos below. They stopped, catching their breath, surveying the destruction that spread out before them like a scene from hell itself. "What do we do now?" Mia asked, voice trembling with exhaustion and fear. James looked at the horizon, at the dark smoke billowing into the sky, and felt a flicker of determination, thin but unyielding. "We survive," he said, gripping her hand tighter. "We keep going until there's nowhere left to go." And with that they turned, leaving the inferno behind as they pressed on toward whatever uncertain future awaited them. The roar of the volcano was deafening now, an all-consuming symphony of destruction that made the very air vibrate. Thick, choking clouds of ash billowed into the sky, casting a suffocating darkness over the mountainside. The heat was unbearable, radiating from the molten rivers that had begun their slow, merciless descent. James and Mia stumbled forward, their steps uneven, their lungs burning with every breath. There was no time to think, no time to panic, only time to move. Every few seconds, the ground beneath them trembled violently, a stark reminder that the mountain could collapse at any moment. James stole a quick glance at Mia, Her face, streaked with soot and fear, was locked in grim determination. She wasn't crying anymore. There was no time for that. "We need to get lower," James panted, his voice nearly drowned out by the chaos around them. He pointed ahead, where a narrow path zigzagged down the mountainside, half hidden by falling debris. "That's our way out." Mia followed his gaze, hesitating for only a second before nodding. "Let's go," she said, her voice hoarse but firm. They pushed forward, each step a battle against the shifting terrain. Rocks crumbled beneath their feet, rolling down into the abyss below. The once solid trail had become treacherous, barely holding together under the relentless tremors. James reached out, grabbing Mia's wrist every time she slipped, steadying her when her footing failed. The world around them was unrecognizable now. What had once been a peaceful mountainside was transforming into a hellscape before their eyes. Then James saw it, the evacuation route, or at least what was left of it. Signs that should have directed them to safety were either missing or buried beneath layers of fallen rock. The metal guardrails that once lined the path had been twisted and torn apart, as if the mountain itself had tried to erase any chance of escape. His stomach dropped. Something wasn't right. The entire city at the base of the volcano should have been in full evacuation mode by now. Alarms should have been blaring. Rescue teams should have been guiding people away. Instead, there was nothing, just fire, smoke, and an eerie sense of abandonment. Mia stopped beside him, her breathing ragged. Where are the signs?" she gasped, scanning the destruction around them. "There should be markers, routes leading to safety. Where the hell is everything?" James had no answer. The more he thought about it, the more his gut twisted into a knot of unease. He had never seen a disaster unfold like this before. There had been no warnings, no tremors leading up to the eruption, no gradual build-up, no scientists on the news predicting a catastrophe. Just a sudden, violent explosion, as if the mountain had decided to wake up and burn everything in its path without a moment's notice. James had grown up hearing stories about volcanoes, how they took years, sometimes decades, to build up to an eruption. This was different. It felt wrong. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered, more to himself than to Mia. He turned to her, his expression tight. "Volcanoes don't just explode out of nowhere." Mia's face was pale beneath the layer of soot. "Then what the hell is this?" she demanded, her voice sharp with both fear and frustration. "Because it sure as hell doesn't look natural to me." Before James could respond, a deep, guttural crack split the air, followed by an ear-splitting explosion. They barely had time to react before a wave of molten rock erupted from the summit, shooting into the sky like a firework gone horribly wrong. The pressure wave hit them like a truck, sending them stumbling backward. James barely managed to stay upright, his ears ringing from the force of the blast. Mia wasn't as lucky. She tumbled to the ground, her hands scraping against the jagged stone. "Mia!" James grabbed her by the arm, hauling her back to her feet. The heat was suffocating now, making it nearly impossible to breathe. Their surroundings were vanishing beneath a thick curtain of ash. Visibility was dropping fast. They had to move. Now. "Come on!" James pulled her forward, forcing their legs to work despite the exhaustion settling deep into their bones. The trail ahead was barely visible, but it was the only option they had. They had to keep moving, no matter how impossible the path seemed. As they stumbled forward, the ground trembled again, and Mia suddenly stopped. James turned back, panic flaring in his chest. "What is it? We have to go." She didn't respond right away. Instead, she turned in a slow, almost mechanical motion, her eyes locking onto something behind them. James followed her gaze and felt his blood turn to ice. There, in the distance, standing on a ridge, overlooking the devastation, was a figure, a man, tall, dressed in dark clothing, his face obscured by the thick smoke. He stood unnaturally still, watching them, not running, not reacting to the chaos around him, just observing. James felt a cold shiver crawl down his spine. There was something unsettling about the way the man remained motionless, as if the destruction surrounding him was nothing more than a controlled spectacle. Then, as if sensing their gaze, the figure turned and walked away, vanishing into the smoke as silently as he had appeared. Mia grabbed James's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "Did you see that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. James swallowed hard, forcing himself to nod. "Yeah," he said, his throat dry. "I saw." There was no time to process what they had just witnessed. The volcano was still erupting, the air thickening with every second, and they were still trapped on the mountainside. But James couldn't shake the feeling that they had just seen something they weren't supposed to see, something that raised more questions than answers. As they moved forward again, Mia's voice broke through the chaos, laced with suspicion. "James, what if this wasn't an accident?" He didn't answer right away. His mind raced, trying to make sense of everything. The missing evacuation routes, the complete lack of warning signs, the man in the smoke. His stomach twisted as a horrible thought began to take shape, one he wasn't ready to say out loud just yet. Instead, he took a deep breath and met Mia's gaze. "Then we're in more danger than we thought." And with that, they kept running, into the unknown, into whatever twisted nightmare awaited them next. James and Mia reached the highest lookout point still standing, their bodies exhausted, lungs burning from the relentless climb through ash and smoke. The air was thick with the stench of sulfur, the distant roar of the volcano, a never-ending growl in the background. Below them, the city lay in eerie chaos, fires consuming buildings, people running in every direction, their panicked movements illuminated by the hellish orange glow of the lava flow carving its destructive path downward. But something was missing, something crucial. James narrowed his eyes, his breath still coming in short. Ragged gasps, the alarms, the sirens, the emergency broadcasts, there were none. Mia wiped soot from her face, blinking hard as if trying to process what she was seeing, or rather, what she wasn't seeing. "James," she murmured, her voice unusually steady despite the destruction around them. "Where's the evacuation system?" James scanned the city again, his stomach twisting. She was right. A disaster of this scale should have triggered every emergency protocol in place. Sirens wailing, warning messages broadcasted through speakers, helicopters circling overhead. But there was nothing. Only the screams of the people who had no idea where to run. He clenched his fists. This wasn't just incompetence. This was something else, something deliberate. "I don't know," he admitted, his voice tight. "But someone shut it all down." Mia exhaled sharply, frustration evident in every tense line of her body. "This doesn't make any sense," she said, pacing in the small space of the lookout. "This isn't just bad timing. This is sabotage. Someone wanted people caught off guard." Her mind raced, connecting dots that weren't fully visible yet. But the picture forming in the shadows of her thoughts was horrifying. James could see it too, the same unspoken realization flickering in her soot-streaked eyes. Someone knew this was going to happen, and they let it. Then, James saw him. At first, he wasn't sure if it was just another figure lost in the smoke and chaos below, but as his gaze sharpened, the man became clearer, standing far too still in the middle of the unfolding disaster. While people ran in blind panic, he stood unmoved, hands casually tucked into the pockets of an expensive-looking suit. His dark sunglasses reflected the molten red of the lava, his expression unreadable. He wasn't running. He wasn't afraid. He was watching as if he had expected every second of this. "Mia," James said slowly, nudging her shoulder. "Look." Mia turned, following his gaze, and the moment she laid eyes on the man, her entire body stiffened. Her breath hitched, her face draining. Of what little color remained beneath the soot. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. That's impossible." James frowned, his grip tightening on her arm. "Who is he?" Mia took a step back, her lips parting, her mind fighting the realization hammering into her like a freight train. She had seen that man before. She had sat in meetings where he stood behind her father, silent and ever-present, like a shadow. His name escaped her, but his purpose was crystal clear. He worked for her father's company. James saw the panic creeping into her expression and shook her slightly. "Mia, talk to me. Who is he?" She swallowed, her throat dry, her heartbeat hammering in her ears. "He works for Lennox Industries," she finally admitted, her voice barely audible over the distant rumbling of the volcano. "I don't know his name, but I've seen him. He's always there, at board meetings, at press, at conferences, but never in the spotlight, always in the background." She turned to James, eyes wide with realization. "James, this isn't a coincidence. He knew this was going to happen." James felt something cold settle in his gut, heavier than the ash falling around them. If this man worked for Mia's father, then Lennox Industries wasn't just connected to this disaster, they had a hand in orchestrating it. But why? What was the motive? Before he could voice his thoughts, the man in the suit turned his head ever so slightly. It was almost imperceptible, but James knew. He had seen in them, and yet he didn't move. He didn't flee or act surprised. He just smirked. The kind of smirk that sent a chill straight through James's bones. The kind that said, "You're exactly where I want you to be." Mia grabbed James's hand, her fingers tightening around his as the weight of the truth crashed down on her. "We have to go," she whispered, her voice edged with something close to fear. "Now," James nodded, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they had just stepped into something far bigger than an eruption, something planned, something controlled. He took one last look at the suited man before pulling Mia away, his mind racing. If Lennox Industries had a hand in this, then running wouldn't be enough. They needed answers, and they needed to find them before it was too late. As they descended from the lookout, slipping back into the chaos of the ruined city, James could feel the weight of unseen eyes following them. Whoever this man was, he wasn't just watching them for curiosity's sake. He was watching them because they weren't supposed to be here, because they weren't supposed to know. And James had the sinking feeling that if they didn't figure out the truth, soon they wouldn't be alive long enough to tell anyone. The heat from the eruption pressed against their backs as James and Mia stumbled down the ruined path, their lungs burning with every breath of ash-laden air. The once clear sky was now a swirling vortex of smoke and fire, the air thick with the acrid scent of molten rock and charred earth. Every step they took felt like a gamble. The ground was unstable, shifting unpredictably beneath their feet. James knew they didn't have much time. The city below was already a battlefield of destruction, buildings collapsing as lava streams carved paths of annihilation through the streets. But as they ran, something else cut through the chaos. A sound, low, rhythmic, mechanical, a heavy whomp, whomp, whomp echoing through the valley. James turned his head toward the sky and saw it, a black helicopter. At first, he thought it was a rescue team, finally arriving to help the thousands of people stranded in the wake of the disaster. His heart surged with something close to relief, but it was short-lived. The helicopter wasn't descending. It wasn't deploying emergency crews. It wasn't even broadcasting evacuation instructions. It was circling, slow and deliberate, its dark silhouette barely visible through the thick plumes of smoke. It hovered over the destruction like a vulture, watching, waiting. James narrowed his eyes. Something about it felt wrong. He had seen helicopters before, news crews, emergency responders, but this was different. The matte black body, the tinted windows, the way it maintained a calculated distance from the actual disaster zone. This wasn't a rescue, this was reconnaissance. Mia stopped beside him, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. When she followed his gaze, she went rigid. "No," she muttered, her voice barely above a whisper. James turned to her, frowning. "What?" She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she took a step forward, eyes locked on the helicopter, as if trying to force her brain to reject what it was processing. Then, as the chopper tilted slightly in the air, revealing more of its side, she saw it, a logo, sleek and subtle, printed near the tail. Mia's entire body stiffened, her fingers curled into fists. James saw the shift in her expression, from shock to realization to something far more dangerous, anger. "I know that symbol," she said through gritted teeth. James followed her gaze, trying to make out the emblem through the haze. It was faint but visible, an intricate insignia, almost too inconspicuous for a corporation that size. "Who does it belong to?" James asked, though deep down he already knew the answer before Mia even spoke. "Lennox Industries," she spat, her voice thick with disbelief. "My father's company." A chill crawled up James's spine. This wasn't a government helicopter. It wasn't military or rescue or even a private security force. It was Lennox Industries, Mia's father's empire, a corporate giant that had no reason to be here. Unless, of course, they did. James exchanged a glance with Mia, and in that moment, they both understood the same terrible truth. This wasn't an accident. The eruption, the silence from the authorities, the missing evacuation routes, everything was connected. James clenched his jaw, his mind racing. "They're not here to help," he muttered, watching the helicopter as it hovered with eerie precision. "They're watching, gathering information." He turned to Mia, whose hands were shaking now, her expression a mixture of fury and fear. "Mia, what does your father's company have to do with this?" She shook her head, her breath uneven. "I don't know," she admitted, but her voice lacked conviction. "But I intend to find out." James could tell she was piecing things together in real time, her mind working through fragments of memories, meetings she had overheard, glimpses of files she hadn't been meant to see. But before she could process it further, the helicopter suddenly shifted, banking sharply to the right. James grabbed Mia's arm and pulled her behind a pile of rubble. They crouched low as the helicopter swept closer, its massive rotors kicking up a violent whirlwind of ash and debris. For a brief moment, James thought, they had been spotted, but the chopper didn't slow down. It simply scanned the area before resuming its slow, predatory circle. James dared to glance up at it again, and that's when he saw them. Figures, shadows moving behind the tinted glass of the cockpit. He couldn't make out their faces, but he knew what they were doing. They were looking for something, or someone. A terrible realization settled over him like a weight. "They're searching," he murmured. "For survivors?" Mia asked. James shook his head, his gut twisting. "No, for us." Mia's breath hitched. "Why? Why would they be looking for us?" But she already knew. James could see it in her eyes. They had survived. They had seen too much. They weren't supposed to make it out of that mountain alive. Whoever was in that helicopter, whoever was pulling the strings, wasn't just here to observe the eruption. They were here to ensure there were no loose ends. James exhaled sharply, his mind shifting into survival mode. They had to disappear. Now. "We need to move," he said, his voice firm. "If they know we're here, we don't have much time." Mia nodded, her face set with grim determination. She had spent her entire life living in the shadow of her father's company, watching from the sidelines as he built an empire on secrets and hidden agendas. But this was something else. And if Lennox Industries was involved in this disaster, then she had no doubt they wouldn't stop until every witness was erased. The helicopter made another slow pass, the hum of its engines vibrating through the ground. James gritted his teeth and grabbed Mia's hand, leading her deeper into the ruins of the city. They needed to stay hidden. They needed answers. And most importantly, they needed to stay alive long enough to expose the truth. They slipped into the shadows. Mia cast one last glance at the helicopter, the logo now permanently burned into her memory. Whatever her father had done, whatever secret Lennox Industries was trying to bury beneath the ash and fire, she was going to uncover it, no matter the cost. James and Mia crouched behind the charred remains of a collapsed wooden cabin, their bodies pressed close to the debris as they tried to steady their breathing. The air was thick with smoke and ash, the acrid scent burning their nostrils as they fought to stay hidden. Every sound around them felt amplified: the distant roar of the still erupting volcano, the crackle of burning wood, the faint metallic creak of a toppled radio tower swaying in the wind. But none of that mattered. The only thing James focused on was the man standing just beyond the rubble, speaking in a low, deliberate voice into a sleek black phone. The same man in the suit, the one who had been watching. James barely dared to move as he tilted his head, straining to catch every word. "Everything is going according to plan," the man murmured, his tone calm, almost casual, as if the entire city wasn't in the process of being consumed by fire and molten rock. He shifted slightly, his polished leather shoes crunching over broken glass. "No, there's no need to accelerate the second phase yet. The main target is still in play." There was a pause, and James could hear a faint, distorted voice on the other end of the line. Whoever he was talking to, they were just as composed as he was. This wasn't panic, this wasn't damage control, this was execution. Beside him, Mia's fingers dug into James's arm, her grip iron tight. He turned his head slightly and saw the look in her eyes, wide, disbelieving, and laced. Something else. Horror, recognition. She knew something. James wanted to ask, to demand an explanation, but he couldn't risk making a sound. Instead, he followed her gaze back to the man, watching as he took a slow, measured step closer to the wreckage of what had once been a small outpost. "And what about the girl?" came the voice on the phone. The question made the hair on the back of James's neck stand on end. The man hesitated for the briefest moment, then exhaled through his nose. "She wasn't supposed to survive." The words sent an immediate, ice-cold chill through James's spine. He didn't have to look at Mia to know that her blood had just run just as cold as his. The man continued, completely unaware that his every word was cutting into the two of them like a knife. "I'll handle it. We have contingencies in place. No loose ends." He tapped something on the side of his phone. A message sent, a new order given. Then, as smoothly as he had spoken, he ended the call and slipped the device into his pocket. James didn't realize he had stopped breathing until Mia grabbed his wrist, her fingers trembling. "Did you hear that?" she whispered, barely audible over the chaos around. "Them." James swallowed hard. "Yeah," he murmured, his voice low but tight with urgency. "And I think we need to get the hell out of here." Mia nodded, but she was still frozen, her mind clearly spinning. She wasn't just scared. She was thinking, piecing things together. Finally, she whispered, "They expected me to die in the eruption. James, that means they knew it was going to happen." The truth hit like a gut punch. This wasn't an accident. It wasn't nature taking its course, wasn't some unpredictable act of God. Someone had made this happen. Someone powerful enough to suppress warnings, to shut down emergency responses, to leave thousands of people to fend for themselves. And now James and Mia weren't just survivors. They were problems. They had overheard too much, seen too much. They weren't supposed to be here. James clenched his jaw. "Your father." He hesitated, then shook his head. "Mia, if this guy works for your dad's company, then he knows," she finished for him, her voice tight. "He had to have known." Mia pressed her hands against her temples, her breath coming in shallow gasps. "I don't understand," she muttered, half to herself. "Why? What possible reason would my father have to—" She stopped suddenly, her expression darkening. James could practically see the gears turning in her head, her mind racing through memories, old conversations, meetings she had attended but never fully understood at the time. "The drilling project," she whispered, her voice hollow. "Lennox Industries was drilling beneath the volcano. My father always said it was for geothermal energy, but—" Her breath hitched. "What if it wasn't?" James felt his stomach tighten. "What if they triggered it?" he finished, the words leaving a bitter taste in his mouth. Mia met his gaze. her face pale despite the layer of ash coating her skin. If they were right, if her father's company had been responsible for this, it meant that the deaths of thousands of people were collateral damage in a controlled event. It meant that this wasn't a disaster, it was a cover-up. James exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "We need to get proof," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "We need to find out exactly what Lennox Industries was doing here before this whole place turns into a graveyard." Mia nodded slowly, but before she could respond, a sudden noise sent their bodies stiff. With tension, a crunch, a shift in the rubble behind them. James's blood ran cold. They weren't alone. The man in the suit had stopped. He turned his head slightly, his movements almost too precise, too calculated. James's instincts screamed at him. He knows someone is listening, knows someone is watching. And if he found them, there would be no escaping this time. James grabbed Mia's wrist. "Move," he whispered, and then they ran. They didn't look back. They didn't dare, because if they did, they might see the moment the man in the suit turned, the exact second his expression shifted from calm detachment to cold efficiency. And if they saw that, then they'd know, without a doubt, that their time was running out. James and Mia moved through the ruined landscape, their bodies aching from exhaustion, their minds running on sheer survival instinct. The world around them was a nightmare. Ashen skies, the distant glow of molten rock still devouring everything in its path, the eerie silence of a city that had been abandoned to die. Every breath felt like inhaling dust and fire, every step a test of balance on the unstable ground. They hadn't seen another living soul in what felt like hours, and the eerie quiet only deepened the dread settling in their bone. When they finally reached the outskirts of the village, James almost didn't believe his eyes. The small town, tucked into the hills just beyond the main evacuation routes, looked untouched by the destruction surrounding it. But there was something even more unsettling about it. It was empty, completely and utterly abandoned. Mia slowed, her breath hitching as she took in the scene before them. The village should have been packed. This was one of the main tourist hubs near the volcano, a place filled with hotels, cafes, and small souvenir shops catering to visitors. And yet, there wasn't a single person in sight. No movement, no sound, no. The buildings stood eerily intact, their doors left ajar, as if the occupants had simply vanished mid-step. A half-finished meal sat abandoned on an outdoor cafe table, a cup of coffee still in its place, long gone cold. A stroller lay tipped over near a fountain, but there was no child, no panicked parent searching for safety. It was as if the entire town had been frozen in time, deserted long before the eruption had even begun. James felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. "This isn't right," he muttered. Mia turned in slow circles, scanning the eerily intact streets, her fingers clenching at her sides. "It's like they knew," she whispered, the weight of her own words making her shudder. "Like they left before it even started." James caught her meaning immediately. There had been no warnings, no official evacuations. They had seen the panic firsthand, watched people flee in terror when the volcano erupted. But here, in this village, there were no signs of panic, no hurried packing, no traffic jams of people desperately trying to escape. It wasn't just an abandoned town, it was a ghost town, and that meant only one thing. The people here had been warned. They had left. Before the rest of the city even knew what was coming, James pushed forward, stepping into the closest building, a small tourist information center, its interior still neatly arranged with brochures and maps scattered across a wooden desk. The air inside was stale, untouched for days, maybe weeks. He ran a hand over the papers, flipping through pamphlets on volcano safety, local hiking trails, and his fingers stopped. A large, detailed map of the volcano lay open on the desk, covered in red markings. His stomach twisted as he took in the details. There were dates, times, exact locations circled, in ink, with handwritten notes beside them. Some had been crossed out as if marking completed objectives. Others had question marks next to them, indicating uncertainty. James didn't need to be a scientist to understand what he was looking at. Someone had been tracking the volcano. Mia stepped beside him, her eyes scanning the map before she reached out and traced a finger over one of the circled locations. "This was before the eruption," she murmured, pointing to a date that had been scribbled 2 days prior. "Someone knew it was going to blow." She turned to James, her expression grim. They didn't just know, they planned for it. The reality of it hit hard. This wasn't just negligence, this was deliberate. Someone had been monitoring the volcano for an exact eruption time, gathering data and leaving before the disaster struck. Whoever they were, they hadn't just abandoned the city, they had used it as part of a larger plan. James exhaled sharply, trying to make sense of it all, when a faint sound broke through the silence. A crackle, a low, intermittent buzz. He turned sharply, scanning the room. The sound was coming from the far end of the building, where an old radio sat, on a shelf near the wall. His pulse quickened as he stepped closer, reaching out hesitantly before pressing his fingers to the knob. The static grew louder, fluctuating in volume, but it wasn't just random noise. There was a pattern, a series of short bursts followed by longer pauses. James didn't need to be fluent in Morse code to recognize it. This was a signal, a message. Mia stepped beside him, her breath shallow. "Someone's broadcasting," she whispered. James nodded, adjusting the frequency slightly, trying to sharpen the signal. But the more he listened, the more unsettled he became. The pattern repeated itself over and over, an unchanging rhythm of coded transmissions. Someone was still out there, someone who had planned for the eruption, left before it happened, and was now sending encrypted messages across the airwaves. And the worst part? It was still live. James exchanged a glance with Mia, both of them realizing the same thing at once. They weren't just uncovering random pieces of a puzzle anymore. They were walking straight into the middle of it. The people who had planned this disaster, who had abandoned the village before it struck, they weren't gone. They were still watching, still operating. And whatever message was being transmitted over that radio, it wasn't for them. It was for someone else, someone who was still carrying out the plan. Mia swallowed hard, forcing herself to speak past the lump in her throat. "James," she said carefully, "if this signal is still broadcasting, it means they're still listening." The realization hit them like a shockwave. They weren't just uncovering secrets, they were exposing themselves in the process. If whoever was behind this had gone to such great lengths to plan the disaster, then they wouldn't hesitate to eliminate loose ends. James turned off the radio in one swift motion, silencing the transmission. They needed to leave now. But as they turned to go, the static crackled to life again, this time without them touching the radio. A final burst of code flickered through the speakers, a message neither of them could understand. But the voice that followed, that was unmistakable, low, calm, and deliberate. Just 3 words. "You are seen." James grabbed Mia's hand, his pulse hammering in his ears. They weren't alone. And now, whoever was watching them knew exactly where they were. James and Mia moved cautiously through the abandoned village, their senses heightened, their bodies still running on the sharp edge of adrenaline. The eerie stillness pressed down on them, amplifying every footstep, every breath. They had barely escaped the strange transmission at the tourist center, and the realization that someone was watching them hadn't left their minds. Whoever was behind this had already proven they were organized, methodical, and if they had been listening, then James and Mia had just placed themselves in the center of whatever was happening. But there was something else, something gnawing at the back of James's mind. The village wasn't just abandoned, it had been cleared out with precision. The people hadn't fled in a rush. They had left in an orderly, systematic way, as if they had been told exactly when to go. That fact alone was more terrifying than the volcano itself. They spotted the hotel at the far end of the street, its large glass doors hanging slightly open. The sign above the entrance read, El Paraíso Inn, its neon letters still glowing faintly under layers of soot and ash. It was strange. Power should have gone out hours ago. Why? Was this building still lit while everything else was dead? James slowed his pace, scanning the entrance before stepping inside, Mia right behind him. The interior was pristine. Far too pristine for a place that should have been abandoned in the wake of a natural disaster. The front desk was empty, but everything was still in place. The chairs pushed in, the computers running, the soft hum of a refrigerator coming from the bar in the back. Someone had been here, and they had left in a way that suggested they weren't running for their lives. They had walked away, calmly and deliberately. Mia moved toward the reception desk, running her fingers along the polished wood surface, her face tight with suspicion. "This place wasn't evacuated," she murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "They left, but they weren't in a hurry." James nodded, his eyes drifting toward the security cameras. Mounted near the ceiling, the red lights blinked softly. They were still active. He felt a shiver creep up his spine. Someone was still watching. Whether it was live surveillance or automated recordings, the fact remained. This hotel wasn't just abandoned. It was a controlled environment. He exhaled slowly. "We need to find out why this place was left intact," he said, scanning the room, "and what the hell they were doing here before they left." Mia nodded, pushing past the reception desk and slipping through a door labeled Staff Only. James followed her into the back office, where rows of filing cabinets lined the walls, untouched, as if the employees had simply stepped out for a break. But on the desk, illuminated by the faint blue glow of a screen, was a tablet, its screen still active, waiting. Mia's fingers hovered over it, a flicker of hesitation in her movements before she reached down and picked it up. The device was unlocked. Whoever had left it here either hadn't expected anyone to come looking or had left it behind on purpose. The screen displayed a list of names, a long scrolling roster filled with hundreds of names. Some were crossed out, others remained unmarked. But one right in the middle caught Mia's eye. Her name, Mia Lennox. Her breath hitched. "James!" she whispered, tilting the screen toward him. He leaned in, his stomach twisting into a cold knot. Her name was there, but it wasn't crossed out. It was highlighted, marked the other names. On the list, some had thick red lines drawn through them, others had small question marks next to them. James couldn't understand the pattern, but one thing was clear. Mia wasn't just on this list, she was important to it. "What the hell is this?" James muttered, scrolling further, scanning the other names. Some he recognized from the city, shop owners, government officials, even a few well-known public figures. But others meant nothing to him. Random names, seemingly unconnected. Why are some of these names crossed out? Mia's fingers trembled slightly as she scrolled downward, her breath growing more uneven. And then, at the very bottom of the list, she saw it. A name she never expected to be there. Her father's, Nathaniel Lennox. Unlike hers, his name was crossed out, a deep, dark line slicing through it. Her pulse pounded in her ears. Why? What did this mean? Was this a list of survivors, targets, or something else entirely? Mia felt her knees weaken, her mind scrambling for an explanation that made sense. Had her father been eliminated? Or had he eliminated himself from this operation? James's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. "Mia, this list, what if it's a record? Of who was supposed to survive?" He turned to her, urgency burning in his eyes. "Think about it. Everyone in that village was gone before the eruption. The ones left in the city, they weren't given a chance. What if this was planned down to who got to leave and who didn't?" Mia's mouth went dry. If James was right, then this wasn't just a disaster, it was an operation, a calculated selection of who mattered and who was expendable. Her fingers tightened around the tablet. Her father's name was crossed out. Did that mean he had been left behind? Or had he chosen to walk away from something he helped set in motion? Mia wasn't sure which option terrified her more. Her father was powerful, but he had always been in control. If his name was crossed out, it meant that for the first time, he wasn't calling the shots anymore. James reached for the tablet, his jaw clenched. "We need to get out of here," he said. But before he could power down the screen, a notification popped up, a new message from an unknown sender. Mia's fingers hovered over the screen before she tapped it. A single line of text appeared. "You were never meant to see this." James didn't hesitate. He grabbed Mia's wrist and pulled her away from the desk, his heart hammering in his chest. They had been found. Someone knew they were here. The cameras, the transmission from the radio, the helicopter, it was all connected. They weren't just uncovering secrets, they were walking straight into a trap. A sharp noise echoed through the hotel, footsteps, slow, deliberate. Coming from the entrance, James extinguished the screen and shoved the tablet into his bag before grabbing Mia's hand. "Move!" he whispered urgently. They didn't wait. They bolted through the back exit, slipping into the alley as the heavy sound of approaching figures grew closer. As they ran, Mia's mind spun with one horrifying realization. Whoever had planned this had decided who would survive, and whoever had sent that message, they weren't finished yet. James and Mia ran through the darkened alleyways of the ghost village, their footsteps muffled against the layer of ash coating the ground. Every shadow felt alive, every abandoned building a potential hiding spot or a trap. The weight of the stolen tablet pressed against James's back, strapped tightly inside his bag. But it wasn't the weight of the device that he felt. It was the weight of the truth. Whatever was happening, whatever had been planned, they had stumbled too far into it. The people responsible weren't going to let them walk away. Mia clutched his wrist tightly as they ducked behind a half-collapsed cafe, pressing themselves against the cold, soot-streaked wall. Her breathing was uneven, her mind clearly still racing from what they had seen. "James," she whispered, barely audible over the distant crackling of fire. "They knew we were in that hotel. Someone is tracking us." James nodded, his eyes scanning the empty street ahead. "Not just tracking," he muttered. "Herding." The word tasted wrong in his mouth, but he knew it was true. They weren't just being followed, they were being directed, pushed toward an outcome someone else had already decided. He didn't know who these men were, but one thing was certain. They weren't here to help. Then they heard them, footsteps, heavy, calculated, closing in, not the frantic, desperate steps of survivors trying to escape the eruption. These were methodical, controlled, predators stalking prey. James didn't hesitate. He grabbed Mia's hand and pulled her forward, sprinting across the open road toward a parking lot on the edge of town. "We need a car," he said between ragged breaths. "If we can get out of here before they catch up." He stopped mid-sentence as his eyes landed on a dark sedan parked at the far end of the lot. It was old but intact, and more importantly, it had keys dangling from the ignition. Mia saw it too, her face lighting up with a brief spark of hope. "Oh my God," she gasped. "James, we might actually have a chance." They reached the vehicle in seconds, and James yanked open the driver's side door. The smell of stale leather filled the air, dust swirling inside as they climbed in. His fingers wrapped around the keys, twisting them. The engine coughed, sputtered, then roared to life. Relief crashed over him like a wave. They had a way out. He turned to Mia, ready to tell her to buckle up when his stomach dropped. The car wasn't moving. The tires. Mia's eyes followed his, and for a second, neither of them spoke. The silence was deafening. All 4 tires had been slashed. Deep, deliberate gashes cut straight through the rubber. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't random. Someone had done this on purpose. James slammed his fist against the steering wheel, a mix of frustration and dread surging through him. "They knew we'd come here," he muttered under his breath. "They knew we'd try to run." Mia pressed her hands to her temples, her pulse hammering in her ears. This wasn't just a group of men searching for them. This was a coordinated hunt. Every exit they reached was already compromised. Every escape route led to another dead end. The message was clear. There was no running. They were meant to be caught. Mia turned to James, her voice barely above a whisper. "James, what if they don't want to kill us?" Her words sent a cold shiver through his spine. "What if they need us alive?" James had been so focused on surviving that he hadn't even considered what came next. If they were meant to die, they wouldn't have made it this far. The hotel, the list of names, the coded transmissions, they were important. Someone had gone to great lengths to control the information they had uncovered. But what if it wasn't about silencing them? What if it was about containing them? A low voice echoed through the lot, cutting through the static of James's thoughts. They couldn't have gone far. James's blood ran cold. He grabbed Mia's arm, shoving her low into the seat. Through the shattered side mirror, he saw them. 4 men in suits, moving in unison, scanning every corner, every alley. They weren't yelling. They weren't panicked. They were hunting. James's mind raced. They couldn't stay in the car. It was a trap. If the men reached them before they got out, it would be over. He turned to Mia, his voice urgent but quiet. "We need to get out. Now." She nodded, swallowing back fear, and together they slipped out of the car as silently as possible. They kept low, moving through the maze of vehicles, staying in the blind spots between parked cars and debris. The men were closing in, their movements precise, their eyes scanning. James's heart pounded as one of them turned, his gaze passing right over their hiding spot. Too close. Then a new sound broke. Through the tension, a distant explosion, a weak building finally collapsing under the weight of destruction. For a split second, the men turned their heads. That was all James and Mia needed. They ran, not toward another road, not toward another car, toward the ruins, toward the wreckage where the smoke was thickest, where their chances of disappearing were highest. James could hear them behind him, the quickened pace of pursuit. They had been seen. The game was up. But James didn't stop. He grabbed Mia's hand, weaving through the rubble, his lungs burning, his body screaming for rest. They couldn't get caught. He didn't know where they were running to. He didn't know if they even had a real way out. But he knew one thing for certain. If they were caught, they wouldn't be seen again. The air was thick with smoke and dust as James and Mia pushed forward, their bodies running on pure adrenaline. They had barely escaped the men in suits, slipping through the ruins like ghosts. But they both knew their time was running out. Every turn, every abandoned street felt like walking, deeper into a trap. But they didn't stop. They couldn't. Somewhere in the back of their minds, they both understood the terrifying reality. Whoever these men were, they weren't just trying to stop them from escaping. They were trying to bury them in silence. James led Mia through a half-collapsed building, once a corporate office, now a skeleton of broken glass and charred metal. They hadn't chosen this place at random. James had seen something earlier, a Lennox Industries sign, half covered in ash. This wasn't just another ruined structure. This place had belonged to Mia's father's company. If there were answers to be found, they would be here. The air inside was stale, filled with the scent of burnt plastic and paper. Desks were overturned, computers smashed, as if someone had left in a hurry, or as if someone had made sure that nothing was left behind. Mia moved quickly, her hands running over the damaged desks, scanning through drawers. Her fingers trembled slightly as she yanked open filing cabinets, rifling through whatever hadn't been reduced to ashes. "There has to be something," she muttered, her voice tight with frustration. They wouldn't have left without covering their tracks completely. James stayed by the entrance, listening for any signs of pursuit. The city outside was still a disaster, the occasional tremor shaking the fragile remains of buildings around them. He turned back to Mia, watching as she tossed aside burnt folders and useless records. And then her hands stopped. At the back of the lowest drawer, hidden behind what looked like empty file holders, was a sealed manila envelope. It was untouched, unburned, almost as if someone had hidden it there before fleeing. Mia's heart pounded as she pulled it free, her fingers tearing through the seal. Inside were documents, dozens of them, official reports, blueprints, geological surveys, all stamped with the Lennox Industries insignia, her father's company. James moved beside her, his eyes scanning the pages as she flipped through them. The words hit like a sledgehammer. Exploratory mining, Operation MT Vega Caldera. Beneath the title were years of records, detailing excavation sites inside the volcano itself. Mia's breath caught in her throat. The reports weren't just about research. They were about drilling, extraction, large-scale excavation beneath the Earth's crust. She felt nausea creep up her throat as the dates on the documents sank in. "They've been drilling for years," she whispered, barely able to form the words. "My father, his company, they were mining inside the volcano." Her fingers clenched the papers as her mind raced. None of this had ever been made public. There had been no news reports, no official acknowledgement that Lennox Industries had even been operating near the volcano, let alone inside it. She turned another page, her eyes scanning over lines of technical jargon and chemical analysis reports. And then she saw it, a section marked geothermal. Anomalies, projected instability risks. James leaned in, reading over her shoulder. "Mia," he said slowly, his voice thick with realization. "These reports, they knew this would happen." Mia flipped through the pages faster now, each document confirming the sickening truth. The deeper the drilling, the more unstable the volcano had become. Warnings had been issued, warnings that had been ignored. The eruption hadn't been a freak accident, it had been triggered. A new wave of horror crashed over Mia. "This wasn't a natural disaster," she whispered. "They caused it." She swallowed hard, forcing herself to continue reading. The final pages were summaries of internal communications, emails, memos, discussions between high-ranking executives. The language was vague, but chillingly clear. They had known. They had planned, and when the inevitable eruption had drawn too close, they had abandoned the city, leaving thousands to die. James clenched his jaw, his fists tightening at his sides. "This was never about energy," he said bitterly. "It was about money, about mining deeper than regulations allowed. And when they realized they had pushed too far," he exhaled sharply, "they covered it up with an eruption." He turned to Mia, his expression hard. "This is why the alarms never went off, why there was no evacuation, why the entire city was left to fend for itself. It wasn't negligence." His voice darkened. It was intentional. Mia's hands shook as she stared at her father's name. Printed at the bottom of the final report, Nathaniel Lennox, authorizing the final phase of operations, signing off on the continued drilling despite the geothermal warnings. His approval was everywhere, his name appearing on documents that confirmed he had known exactly what would happen. Tears burned at the corners of her eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She had spent her whole life defending her father, convincing herself that, despite his flaws, he was still a good man, that his company, his empire, had been built on innovation, not destruction. But this was beyond corruption. This was mass murder. James saw the turmoil in her face, the way her shoulders tensed as if bracing for impact. "Mia," he said carefully, "we need to go." He reached for the documents, stuffing them into his bag. "Whatever's happening here, we just became the biggest threat to it. If they find us..." Mia took a shuddering breath and nodded. She knew what he meant. They weren't just running from the disaster anymore. They were running from a billion-dollar cover-up, and now they had the proof. As they turned to leave, a deep rumble shook the ground beneath them. The volcano was still angry, still spilling its fury onto the land. But Mia knew the true disaster had started long before the eruption. James's head throbbed as he drifted back into consciousness, his skull pounding like a war drum. The world around him was dark, the air thick with the scent of oil, rust, and something else, something acrid and unmistakable. Smoke. His body ached, muscles stiff from being bound for who knew how long. The last thing he remembered was running, dodging through the crumbling ruins with Mia by his side, gripping the stolen documents like a lifeline. Then came the ambush, heavy boots pounding against the pavement, a sharp crack against his skull. Darkness. He forced his eyes open, blinking rapidly. Against the dim light of flickering bulbs overhead, the walls around him were corrugated metal, rusted and streaked with soot. The floor was cold, uneven concrete, and in the far corner, a stack of barrels sat labeled with hazardous material warnings. Industrial chemicals, explosives. They weren't just in any warehouse. They were inside a controlled demolition zone. His stomach twisted as the realization sank in. A groan echoed beside him, and James turned sharply. Mia, she was slumped against a metal support beam, her wrists bound behind her back, a fresh bruise forming on her temple. She was breathing, but barely. He leaned toward her, nudging her shoulder. "Mia, wake up!" Her eyelids fluttered, and for a moment there was only confusion, before panic slammed into her like a freight train. She jerked upright, struggling against the restraints. What? Where? Then she saw James, saw the room, the barrels. The reality of their situation hit her in an instant. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, coming from somewhere beyond the dimly lit space. The metal door groaned open, and James stiffened as a figure stepped inside. The man in the suit. The same man they had seen watching the eruption, the same one giving orders over the phone. He walked with the confidence of someone who had already won, his expression unreadable behind the gleam of polished sunglasses. He adjusted his cuffs, taking his time before speaking. "James Carter," he mused, his voice calm, methodical. "And Mia. Lennox." His lips curled slightly at the corners. "You two have been very busy." Mia stiffened at the sound of her last name leaving his mouth. He knew exactly who she was. James clenched his jaw, forcing himself to meet the man's gaze. "What do you want?" The man took a slow step forward, clasping his hands behind his back. "Want?" he echoed, tilting his head slightly. "That's the wrong question. The right question is, why are you still alive?" James didn't flinch, but he felt the weight of those words press against his chest, like a loaded gun. The man crouched down so he was eye level with James, his voice dropping to something almost mocking. "You've been digging into things you don't understand, finding things you shouldn't have, and now—" He stood up again, smoothing out the front of his suit. "Now you know too much." The words were spoken so simply, so effortlessly, as if he were stating a fact rather than delivering a death sentence. Mia's breath hitched. She had known deep down that they had gone too far, that whoever was behind this wouldn't just let them walk away. But hearing it said out loud, so coldly, made it real. They weren't being questioned, they weren't being threatened. They had already been marked for elimination. She swallowed hard, forcing herself to focus. "You can't cover this up forever," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "People will figure out what happened. The truth will come out." The man turned his head slightly, as if amused by the attempt at defiance. Then, slowly, he removed his sunglasses, revealing sharp, piercing grey eyes that held nothing but calculation. "Oh, Miss Lennox," he murmured, his tone dripping with condescension. "You think this is about hiding the truth?" He let out a quiet chuckle. "No, the truth doesn't need to be hidden. It just needs to be controlled." James's stomach twisted. That was it. That was why they had been taken here. Not for interrogation, for disposal. They weren't liabilities anymore. They were simply inconveniences to be erased. The man gestured toward the barrels in the corner. "We'll make this clean. A final aftershock from the eruption. Unfortunate casualties." His expression didn't change. "No one will question it." Mia felt bile rise in her throat. They were going to stage their deaths as part of the disaster. Their bodies would be found charred, buried under rubble, their deaths attributed to the destruction of the volcano. No one would look further. No one would ask questions. It would be perfect. The thought sent a bolt of fury through her. They were just disposable. Another footnote in a catastrophe orchestrated by men in suits. Men like her father. James yanked at the zip ties around his wrists, testing their strength. They were tight, cutting into his skin, but not unbreakable. He glanced at Mia, his mind racing. They had to get out. Now. But there were still too many unknowns. How many guards were outside? How much time did they have before the accident was set in motion? The suited man exhaled as if bored and turned to the door. "I'd get comfortable if I were you," he said over his shoulder. "Not that it'll matter soon." He nodded toward the two men standing at the entrance. "Make sure it looks natural." Then he was gone. Mia's pulse skyrocketed. The guards moved toward them, their expressions cold, detached, professional executioners. James flexed his wrists again, calculating, timing. They needed a distraction, something to turn the odds, even just for a second. He turned his gaze to the barrels again, an idea sparking. In his mind, explosives. The warehouse was filled with chemicals, fuel, volatile materials. If they could create chaos, they might have a chance. Mia saw the flicker of a plan in his eyes and gave a barely perceptible nod. They weren't going to die here. Not today. One of the guards stepped forward, reaching for James's collar to yank him up. And that was when James made his move. He twisted sharply, throwing his full weight into the man's knees, sending him sprawling backward. Mia didn't hesitate. She drove her knee into the second guard's stomach, using the momentum to kick the chair backward, breaking it apart in the process. James yanked his arms forward, the zip ties snapping against the sharp edge of the chair leg. They were free. The first guard scrambled for his weapon, but James was already on him, grabbing the nearest barrel and slamming it against the man's face. The second guard lunged for Mia, but she was faster, ducking beneath his grasp and driving an elbow into his ribs. A gunshot rang out. A miss. Then, James grabbed a metal pipe and swung. The barrel nearest the wall tipped over, spilling liquid across the floor. He didn't know what it was, but he saw the warning. Label, highly flammable. Mia's gaze snapped to him, both of them reaching the same realization at once. They needed to light it. James grabbed the guard's fallen gun, aiming not at the men, but at the floor. One shot, one spark. That was all they needed. The guard's eyes widened as realization dawned, but it was too late. James pulled the trigger. The warehouse ignited. The acrid stench of smoke and burnt chemicals still clung to Mia's skin as she and James were dragged through the dimly lit corridor of what looked like another industrial facility. Her wrists were raw from the restraints, her body aching from the explosion they had barely escaped. But despite the chaos of the warehouse fire, they hadn't made it far. The men in suits had been waiting. They had been outnumbered, overpowered, and now they were prisoners once again. James gritted his teeth as a guard shoved him forward, his arms still bound behind his back. He had been fighting against their restraints for the last hour, searching for any weakness. But whoever had tied them up this time knew what they were doing. The zip ties dug into his skin, cutting off circulation, but he barely felt it over the boiling rage seething beneath the surface. They had been so close. The fire had bought them only minutes before more men had arrived, weapons drawn, ready to finish what the first group had failed to do. And now, they were being led deeper into enemy territory, into the belly of whatever monster had orchestrated this nightmare. Mia kept her head high as they reached a large steel door. At the end of the corridor, she could feel her heartbeat hammering against her ribs, her mind spinning with everything she had learned in the last 24 hours. Her father's company was behind the eruption. They had known about the instability beneath the volcano. They had caused it. And now, as they were forced inside a vast, dimly lit chamber, she had a sickening feeling that she was about to meet the man who had signed the death sentence for thousands of people. The room was cold, sterile. Unlike the burning world outside, this place had been untouched by the disaster. It was underground, insulated, controlled. At the center of the room stood a figure, tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a sleek black suit. A mask covered his face, a smooth, featureless surface that made him look more like a machine than a man. He stood with an air of patience, as if he had been expecting them. James felt his stomach tighten. This wasn't just another corporate enforcer. This was the man in charge. "Untie them," the masked figure ordered, his voice deep, calm, too calm. The guards hesitated, but at a sharp glance from the man, they obeyed, cutting the restraints from James and Mia's wrists. He wasn't afraid of them. That was what unsettled James the most. He didn't see them as threats. He saw them as expendable. Mia rubbed her wrists, glaring at their captor. "Who the hell are you?" she demanded, her voice sharp despite the exhaustion weighing on her. The man tilted his head, slightly before reaching up, fingers pressing against the edges of his mask. A slow, deliberate movement, and then he removed it. Mia's breath caught in her throat. She knew him. James saw the shock in her face before he turned his own gaze toward the man. He was in his late 40s, sharp features, silvering hair at the temples, a face that had been in the background of every Lennox Industries press release. Daniel Kessler, one of her father's top executives. Mia's entire body went rigid. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. Kessler had been with her father's company for years. She had seen him at dinners, in board meetings, standing just behind her father with the same quiet efficiency as the other men in suits. He had always been there, always watching. But now, he wasn't just another executive. He was at the center of all of this. James clenched his fists, every muscle in, his body coiled with tension. "So it's you," he muttered. "You're the one pulling the strings." Kessler let out a low chuckle, shaking his head. "No, Carter," he said smoothly. "I'm just the one cleaning up the mess." He turned his gaze back to Mia, his expression unreadable. "And you," he continued, his voice almost disappointed, "you were never meant to leave that mountain alive." Mia felt like the air had been sucked from her lungs. She stared at him, unable to process the weight of those words. He had expected her to die. James took a step closer, his voice low, furious. "Why?" he demanded. "Why let an entire city burn? Why kill thousands of people? What the hell were you covering up?" Kessler sighed, as if exhausted by their ignorance. "You still don't get it, do you?" He gestured toward the polished steel table behind him, where stacks of documents lay waiting. The same reports Mia and James had stolen from the warehouse. "The eruption was inevitable," Kessler said smoothly. "The drilling operation reached depths no human hands should have touched. We knew the volcano was unstable, but pulling out would have been..." He hesitated, then smiled faintly. "A financial disaster." His voice was so cold, so calculated that James felt a fresh wave of rage swell inside him. "So you triggered the eruption," Mia said, her voice shaking. "You destroyed an entire city. So what? You could cover up your failures." Kessler didn't deny it. He just nodded. "There was no avoiding it," he said simply. "But chaos can be useful. It distracts people. It makes them forget what was happening before the disaster. And when the dust settles, Lennox Industries remains intact." James felt his fingers twitch, his body screaming for him to do something, anything. But Kessler wasn't done. He turned back to Mia, his gaze sharp. "Your father was a liability," he said, his voice quieter now. "He didn't have the stomach to do what needed to be done." Mia's breath caught. "What?" Kessler's lips curled into something like a smirk. "He wanted to stop the operation," he said, simply. "But by then it was too late, so I made the decision for him." He let the words sink in. "Nathaniel Lennox is dead, Mia." The words ripped through her. She took a shaky step backward, her vision blurring, her ears ringing. No, he couldn't be. Her father had built Lennox Industries. He had run it. He was powerful, untouchable, but Kessler had taken it all from him. "You..." Her voice broke, fury and grief colliding inside her like a storm. Kessler tilted his head slightly. "I did what was necessary." Then he glanced at the guards. "Just like we're about to do with you." James lunged, But before he could reach Kessler, the guards moved first. The last thing James saw was the butt of a rifle swinging toward his skull. Then, darkness. A thick haze of smoke filled James's lungs as he struggled to regain consciousness. His skull throbbed from the blow he had taken, and for a brief moment, the world around him was nothing but blurred shadows and distant echoes. The acrid scent of burning chemicals mixed with molten rock, a stark reminder that they were running out of time. Then the sharp sound of metal groaning under intense heat snapped him fully awake. The warehouse was on fire, and they were still inside. His wrists were bound again, though sloppily this time, a mistake. His captors had assumed he'd be unconscious for longer. The heat in the air was suffocating, waves of unbearable warmth pressing against his skin. The fire had spread fast, igniting the chemicals stored throughout the warehouse, sending flames licking up the steel walls. The structure wasn't going to last much longer. He turned his head, wincing, as pain shot through his temple. Mia. She was still next to him, slumped over, her breathing shallow. Her wrists were bound too, her face streaked with soot and blood. James didn't waste another second. Gritting his teeth, he twisted his wrists, forcing his fingers to work past the tight binding. The plastic cut into his skin, but he ignored the pain, using the slight give in the restraints to his advantage. He yanked hard, his wrists burning as the zip ties snapped. Free. His hands flew to Mia's bindings next, shaking her gently. Mia, wake up. We have to go. She stirred, her eyes fluttering open, then widening in alarm as the heat pressed against them. The warehouse shuddered violently, the ground beneath them groaning like a wounded beast. Outside, the volcano's roar was deafening, a relentless surge of sound that sent tremors through the entire structure. Lava was closing in. The warehouse was built dangerously close to the flow, and now its very foundations were melting from the intense heat. Another explosion rocked the building, sending pieces of the ceiling crashing down. James grabbed Mia's arm, pulling her up. We need to move, now. She nodded, still, disoriented, but understanding the urgency in his voice. They stumbled forward through the thick smoke, weaving between crates and burning debris. The exit was too far, already blocked by collapsing beams and molten steel. They needed another way out. That's when James spotted it. A rusted hatch at the far end of the room, partially hidden beneath fallen metal sheets. He sprinted toward it, shoving debris aside, ignoring the scalding heat against his palms. The hatch was old, its hinges corroded, but when he gripped the handle and yanked, it moved. He pushed harder, forcing the metal to give, away, revealing a dark tunnel beneath, an escape route. It was narrow, leading downward into what looked like an underground storage passage. It had to go somewhere. Mia coughed against the smoke, eyes burning as she peered into the tunnel. Where does it lead? James shook his head. I don't know, but we don't have a choice. The heat intensified behind them as the fire consumed everything, turning the warehouse into an inferno. With one final glance at the collapsing ceiling, James grabbed Mia's hand and they jumped. The tunnel was steep, their bodies sliding down a rough metal incline. It felt endless, their descent only stopping when they tumbled onto solid ground, a narrow underground chamber lined with old equipment, fuel canisters, and most importantly, a vehicle. James barely had time to process it, his eyes landing on a small aircraft, a battered old smuggling plane, parked neatly inside what looked like a hidden runway. Mia pushed herself up, wiping soot from her face, eyes widening at the sight. James, this was an escape route. He nodded, already moving. For them, but now, it's ours. Whoever had been operating here, they had planned for their own evacuation. This plane wasn't for them. It had been intended for the men in suits, the ones controlling everything. But their mistake. They hadn't accounted for James and Mia surviving this long. James climbed into the cockpit, scanning the controls. It was old, but functional. He knew enough about planes to recognize that it had been modified for off-the-grid travel, stripped of identifying markers, loaded with fuel. But as he reached for the controls, his hand hit something, a small metal case tucked under the seat. Strange. Mia climbed in beside him, still catching her breath. "What is that?" she asked, eyeing the case as James pried it open. Inside was a single flash drive, small, unassuming, but James knew this wasn't just any drive. If it was hidden here, inside the escape vehicle of the people behind this disaster, then it had to be important. Mia's hands trembled slightly as she picked it up, turning it over in her fingers. "This could be everything," she whispered. "Proof of what they did." James met her gaze, his expression grim but determined. "Then we make sure the world sees it." Another violent tremor ripped through the tunnel, the walls shaking as lava finally breached the warehouse above them. The heat was intolerable now, burning the air itself. James had no more time to think. He threw the flash drive into his pocket, flipped the ignition switch, and the plane roared to life. Mia secured the hatch as James slammed the throttle forward. The aircraft lurched, rolling down the narrow runway, metal screeching against the rough ground. Behind them, the tunnel collapsed, a wave of fire and molten rock swallowing everything in its path. Mia gripped the sides of her seat as the plane accelerated. "James, I see it!" he shouted, his hands tightening around the controls. The end of the tunnel was ahead, but the ground was buckling, the exit already starting to cave in. They had one shot. James pulled back on the controls, and the plane lifted. The wheels scraped the crumbling edge of the tunnel just as the entire underground chamber caved in. A fiery explosion erupted beneath them, but the aircraft burst into the open air, soaring above the burning wreckage. James exhaled sharply, gripping the controls as the plane steadied itself. Below them, the volcano still raged, the city beneath its shadow barely visible through the smoke and fire. But they were out, alive. Mia let out a breathless, disbelieving laugh, her hands still clutching the flash drive. "We made it," she whispered. James glanced at her, a small smirk breaking through the exhaustion. "Not yet," he said. "We still have to bring them down." And with that, they disappeared. Into the clouds, evidence in hand, ready to expose the truth. The sound of the propellers still hummed in Mia's ears long after they landed the smuggling plane in a remote airstrip outside the city. It was a miracle they had made it out at all, but there was no time to process their survival. Not yet. The truth they carried was heavier than any wreckage left. Behind, James clutched the flash drive in his pocket as they hurried through the dimly lit streets of a city that had already started shifting its focus. News stations blared reports of the devastation, rescue efforts, missing persons, but not a single mention of Lennox Industries or the mining operations beneath the volcano. The cover-up had begun, and they were running out of time. Their meeting had been arranged in whispers and urgency. A journalist, one of the last few who hadn't sold their integrity to the corporations, Elliot Park. His name wasn't widely known, but among those who mattered, he had a reputation for exposing the untouchable. If there was anyone who could break this story before it got buried, it was him. The location, a rundown cafe, late at night, with every precaution taken. Mia and James sat in a back booth, their bodies exhausted but their minds sharp. The weight of the flash drive between them felt like a ticking bomb. Elliot arrived in a worn-out leather jacket, his dark eyes scanning the room before sliding into the seat across from them. He looked exactly as James had imagined, tired but relentless, the kind of man who had been chasing the truth for too long to turn back now. "I hope you understand," Elliot said in a low voice. "If this is bullshit, you've wasted the last bit of goodwill I have left." Mia didn't blink. She reached into her jacket, pulled out the flash drive, and slid it across the table. "Then watch," she said simply. "And tell me if it's bullshit." Elliot plugged the drive into a small tablet, his fingers moving quickly across the screen as file after file loaded. Blueprints of the drilling operation, geological reports predicting the inevitable collapse, emails between Lennox Industries executives confirming the decision to let the eruption happen. Mia's father's name everywhere. At first, Elliot's face was unreadable, but as the minutes passed, his lips parted slightly. His fingers tightened around the tablet. Then, slowly, he exhaled. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. James leaned forward. "Can you get it out?" Elliot didn't answer immediately. His eyes flickered with something James didn't like. Hesitation. He had expected shock, even anger, but not doubt. "This is enough to blow the whole thing wide open," Elliot admitted. "But you know what happens to people who expose this kind of shit, right?" He looked up at Mia. "If this goes live, your father will deny everything," Mia interrupted, her voice flat. "And that's exactly why you need to publish it." There was no wavering in her eyes, no hesitation in her voice. She had made peace with the consequences. She wasn't here to save her father. She was here to destroy him. Elliot studied her for a long moment before nodding. "All right," he said. "I'll send it to every major network, leak it to independent sources, and upload it on every platform I can reach. This isn't just a scandal. This is a corporate massacre. The world will see it." James felt the tension in his chest loosen just slightly. For the first time, they had the upper hand. But even as relief started creeping in, Mia's eyes stayed sharp. "They're not just going to sit back and let this happen," she muttered. Elliot nodded grimly. "They'll fight it, with everything." They have. The news broke faster than even Mia had anticipated. Within hours, the footage, documents, and internal communications had spread like wildfire. Lennox Industries, one of the most powerful corporations in the world, was no longer just a business empire. It was a crime scene. News anchors spoke with a mixture of disbelief and fury as they detailed how the company had knowingly caused the destruction of an entire city. Protests erupted in the streets. Stockholders began pulling out. Government officials scrambled to distance themselves. And Nathaniel Lennox, the man at the center of it all, finally made his move. Mia sat in a small motel room, staring at the television screen as her father appeared for the first time since the scandal broke. His face was calm, too calm. She had expected desperation, an attempt at redemption, but instead he looked untouched. The accusations against Lennox Industries are false and defamatory. Her father's voice rang through the screen. "This is a blatant attack on the integrity of my company, fabricated by individuals who seek to exploit a tragic natural disaster." His words were rehearsed, his tone smooth. "The so-called evidence presented has been manipulated, taken out of context. The real criminals are those who would spread misinformation in a time of mourning." Mia's fists clenched. He wasn't denying involvement. He was rewriting the truth. And worst of all, it was working. The networks were already running conflicting narratives. Some anchors hesitated, calling for further investigation. The same powerful men who had stood behind Lennox Industries for years were now speaking out in carefully crafted statements of support. The machine was moving, and it was moving fast. James swore under his breath. "They're covering it up." Elliot sat back, rubbing his face. "They're trying, but it's not over yet." He gestured toward the screen. "People aren't stupid. They see the documents, the footage. His words don't match the facts." He turned to Mia. "But they're going to bury this unless we keep pushing. You know. That right?" Mia nodded. She had known it from the moment the flash drive landed in Elliot's hands. The truth wasn't enough. They had to make sure it stuck. The protests needed to grow. The officials needed to break under pressure. Lennox Industries had spent years controlling the story. It was time to rip that control away. And then the text came. James's phone vibrated once. A single message from an unknown number. "You have no idea who you're up against." James felt the blood in his veins turn ice cold. He turned the screen to Mia, and when her eyes met his, he knew this wasn't over. It had never been about her father. Someone even more powerful was still pulling the strings. Did this story make you feel something special? Share your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear from you. Here at Whispered Realms, every story takes days to craft, with great care to transport you to worlds filled with mystery and emotion. If you enjoyed this, don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. It helps us keep bringing you more unforgettable stories. And if you're ready for another journey, there are more videos waiting for you. Thank you for your time and support. See you in the next story.